You won't believe what happened to a man just trying to live his life when two women decided to make a terrible assumption about him based on nothing but the color of his skin. In today's video, we're diving into a situation that quickly spiraled out of control, leaving everyone involved shocked, angry, and confused. Imagine this: a quiet suburban park, kids playing, families having picnics, and a man minding his own business, enjoying the fresh air. That's when things take a dark turn. Two women, seemingly ordinary at first glance, approach him. Their expressions are tense, their voices sharp, and before anyone realizes what's happening, accusations are flying. The man, stunned, tries to stay calm, but the words coming out of the women's mouths are beyond disturbing. They accuse him of something serious, something that could ruin his life. And the reason? He's black. That's it. He doesn't know them, he hasn't spoken to them, yet somehow these women feel justified in targeting him. They call the police, insisting they're in danger, even though he's done nothing wrong. What happens next is a whirlwind. The situation escalates. People around the park start to notice. Phones come out, recording the confrontation. Will the police believe these women's baseless accusations? Or will the truth come to light before it's too late? Stay tuned, because the next part of this story will leave you speechless. You won't want to miss what happens when the real facts come to the surface, and the true character of everyone involved is revealed. As the camera phones rolled and people began gathering at a distance, you could feel the tension rise in the air. The man stood his ground, calm but visibly shaken. He tried to reason with the two women, asking them what exactly he had done. His voice was steady, but there was a slight tremble, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. The women, however, seemed determined to escalate things further. They started talking loudly, almost as if they were performing for the growing crowd around them. "He's been following us. He's been watching us for hours," one of the women shouted. Her friend nodded in agreement, chiming in with, "We don't feel safe. We need help." It was obvious to anyone watching that these accusations had no basis in reality. The man had been there just as long as anyone else in the park, minding his own business. He had no interaction with these women until now. But in moments like these, facts often seem to take a backseat to appearances. And sadly, the women knew they had the advantage in this situation. The onlookers seemed frozen, unsure of what to do. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others hesitated, as if waiting for someone else to intervene. You could almost feel their internal struggle. Should they step in and speak up, or stay silent and avoid getting involved? The man, on the other hand, remained composed. He didn't yell back or show aggression. Instead, he tried to defuse the situation by calmly explaining that he had no idea what they were talking about. "I wasn't following you. I'm just here, enjoying my day like everyone else," he said, his voice carrying both disbelief and frustration. His words, however, seemed to fall on deaf ears. The women continued to rant, dialing up their performance, hoping to gain sympathy from the people watching. As the accusations grew louder, the man pulled out his phone too. He started recording the encounter, a quiet act of self-preservation. The look in his eyes revealed a mix of anger and exhaustion, as if this wasn't the first time he'd been through something like this. And maybe, in that moment, he realized that without video evidence, his side of the story might never be believed. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and the tension was palpable. The man stood there, holding his phone up, not backing down, but also not escalating the situation further. Then, the sound of distant sirens broke through the tense atmosphere. The police were on their way, summoned by the frantic call of the women, who continued to paint the man as a threat. As the sirens grew louder, the crowd began to murmur, shifting uneasily. Some of the bystanders started discussing what they had just witnessed, wondering what would happen when the police arrived. Would they believe the women without question? Would they even give the man a chance to explain his side of the story? The uncertainty hung over everyone, like a dark cloud, leaving them all on edge. The police arrived within minutes, lights flashing as they pulled up near the park entrance. The women immediately rushed over to them, acting like victims who had just escaped a dangerous situation. Their exaggerated body language and frantic tone made it clear they were playing up their fear, hoping to convince the officers of their story. But the man didn't move. He stood still, phone in hand, watching as the officers approached the women first. The police officers seemed calm and collected, but you could tell they were taking the women's words seriously. After all, they had no reason yet to doubt them. As the officers nodded and listened to the women's claims, you could see the man's expression harden. He had been here before, falsely accused, put in a position where he had to prove his innocence, even though he had done nothing wrong. One of the officers turned and walked toward the man, his face neutral, though his eyes were watchful. "Sir, we received a report of suspicious behavior. These women are saying you've been following them. Can you explain your side of things?" The man nodded, keeping his voice calm as he spoke. "I haven't been following anyone. I've been here, sitting on that bench for most of the afternoon. They approached me out of nowhere, accusing me of things I didn't do." He pointed to his phone, which was still recording. "I have everything on video, if you'd like to see it." The officer hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the women, who were still talking animatedly to the other officer. Then, he turned back to the man. "I'm going to need to see that video. But before we get into that, can I ask you for your ID?" The request for ID felt like a blow, though the man had expected it. He handed it over without protest, but there was a flicker of frustration in his eyes. This was the part that always stung the assumption that he needed to prove who he was, that his words weren't enough without documentation. As the officer looked over his ID, the crowd remained quiet, watching closely but still keeping their distance. Some people had stopped recording, while others were still holding their phones, unsure of what would happen next. The tension was thick, and it seemed like no one wanted to be the first to speak out. Meanwhile, the women were growing more agitated, noticing that the man wasn't being immediately taken away. "What's taking so long?" one of them demanded. "We told you, he's dangerous. Why aren't you doing anything?" The officer with the man took a deep breath before responding. "We're following procedure, ma'am. Please give us a moment." He then looked back at the man. "Do you mind showing me that video now?" The man nodded and started scrolling through his phone, pulling up the footage he had recorded. He handed the phone to the officer, who watched the video carefully, his expression not giving anything away. As the officer reviewed the video, a noticeable shift began to ripple through the crowd. A few people who had seen the entire encounter started to speak up, quietly at first, but with growing confidence. "I've been here the whole time," a woman from the crowd said, stepping forward slightly. "He didn't do anything." Those women just walked up to him and started accusing him. Another person, an older man sitting on a nearby bench, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I saw the whole thing. He was just minding his own business. They're making all this up." The police officer glanced up from the phone, looking at the growing number of people who were now speaking out in the man's defense. He handed the phone back and nodded once, his tone more neutral. "We're going to need to speak with some of these witnesses. Please stay here while we sort this out." The man gave a brief nod, feeling a small sense of relief that, at least for now, the situation hadn't taken an even worse turn. But the tension was far from over. The women, realizing that things weren't going exactly as planned, grew more desperate. Their voices raised again, accusing the man of intimidating them, making them feel unsafe just by standing there. As the officers spoke to the witnesses and reviewed the video footage, it became clear that the women's story wasn't holding up. But that didn't stop them from trying to push the narrative, hoping that sheer persistence would make their lies stick. The crowd, now emboldened by those who had spoken out, began murmuring louder. People exchanged stories, sharing what they had seen, and the atmosphere shifted slightly. It was no longer just about one man being falsely accused. It was about standing up for what was right, about not letting fear and prejudice win. Yet, even with the tide turning in his favor, the man remained cautious. He knew all too well that these things could change in an instant. All it took was one wrong move, one wrong assumption, and his life could be upended. As the police continued their investigation, he kept his distance, waiting for the truth to fully come to light. But just as the situation seemed to be resolving, something unexpected happened. One of the women received a phone call. Her face, already flushed with frustration, drained of color as she listened to the voice on the other end. She muttered something to her friend, and they both glanced nervously at the police officers, then at the man. It was clear that whatever had been said on that phone call had shaken them. ASA. The woman listened intently on the phone. Her expression shifted from frustration to fear. The crowd around them could sense the change. Whispers began to ripple through the group, curiosity and concern mixing in the air. The man, still standing resolutely, caught snippets of the conversation, words like officer, and evidence floated toward him. His heart raced, and for a moment he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, the tide would turn entirely in his favor. But that hope was quickly overshadowed by an undercurrent of dread. The woman hung up abruptly and turned to her friend, her voice barely above a whisper, but laced with urgency. "We need to leave. Now." The urgency in her tone was palpable. The two women exchanged frantic glances, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation they had created for themselves. They were not just dealing with the man anymore. They were now up against the weight of potential repercussions from the police. The officer, having overheard their hushed conversation, stepped closer, eyebrows raised. "Is there something you'd like to share with us?" His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it. The tension in the air became thick enough to cut. The crowd, sensing the shift, leaned in, eyes wide, waiting for the next move. The women hesitated, their bravado faltering. They had come into the park, ready to frame a narrative that painted them as victims. But now it felt like the walls were closing in on them. The first woman, who had been the loudest in her accusations, looked from the officer to the growing crowd and back again. "No, it's nothing. Just let's go," she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. In that moment, the man's heart sank. They were trying to escape, to dodge accountability for their actions. He felt a surge of frustration, and for a brief second, he considered confronting them directly. But he knew better. He needed to keep his cool. The police were watching, and every move counted. As the officer continued to press for answers, the other woman spoke up, her voice shaky. "We didn't mean to cause any trouble. We were just scared." She looked at her friend, as if seeking solidarity, but only found panic mirrored back. The crowd continued to murmur, some expressing disbelief, while others were appalled that the women had tried to fabricate such a story. Just then, another police car pulled up, lights flashing, cutting through the tension like a knife. Two additional officers stepped out, surveying the scene before heading over. The original officer quickly updated them on the situation, and the energy shifted again. The arrival of more officers added an air of authority, but it also magnified the stakes for everyone involved. The man couldn't help but notice how the women shifted on their feet, visibly uneasy. He felt a small sense of satisfaction at their discomfort, but that was quickly replaced by concern. The stakes were high, and if the women managed to spin their narrative just right, it could end poorly for him, even if he hadn't done anything wrong. As the officers conferred with one another, the man seized the opportunity to address the growing crowd. "I want to thank everyone who has stood up for me," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm just here, enjoying my day. I didn't come here to cause trouble or be a threat to anyone." His words seemed to resonate with many in the crowd, who nodded and murmured in agreement. The officers acknowledged his statement, but maintained their focus on the women. "We need to get to the bottom of this," one of the new officers said firmly, looking directly at them. "We have your statements, but we also need to know if you want to press charges." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. The women exchanged glances filled with panic. Would they dare press charges against the man who had done nothing? What if the police investigated them further and uncovered the truth behind their fabricated claims? The stakes were rising, and they could feel the weight of their choices pressing down on them. I don't know what you mean," the first woman finally stuttered, her voice trembling. The confidence she had when calling the police seemed to evaporate, replaced by fear and uncertainty. "We were just confused, that's all. He didn't do anything." The officers exchanged glances, clearly not buying her explanation. It was becoming apparent to everyone present that the narrative was crumbling. Yet before they could delve deeper, a voice rang out from the back of the crowd. "That's not true. You were the ones who started this whole mess." A man stepped forward, emboldened by the tension in the air. The women turned, eyes wide, clearly taken aback by the sudden shift in support for the man. The crowd started to rally behind the man, voices rising in unison. "You can't just accuse someone like that. What kind of example are you setting?" The unity among the crowd only intensified the women's anxiety, and they began to fidget, casting desperate glances at the officers. The first officer cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Everyone, please remain calm. We need to focus on the facts here." He turned his attention back to the women. "If you're not going to press charges, then it seems you've wasted our time with a false report." Panic surged in the women's eyes, and they exchanged frantic whispers. The facade they had built was crumbling, and it felt as if the ground beneath them was giving way. "What do we do?" one of them hissed. The other replied, "We can't let this happen. We have to stick to our story." But the officers weren't having it. "This isn't a game," one of the new officers said sternly. "Making false accusations can lead to serious consequences. You need to understand that." The man watched as the women's bravado evaporated completely. They were cornered, and the fear radiating from them was palpable. Would they finally confess to the truth, or would they double down on their lies? He felt a mix of anticipation and trepidation, knowing that whatever happened next would have a lasting impact on everyone involved. As the crowd grew restless, the situation reached a boiling point. The tension crackled in the air, and everyone was on edge, anticipating what the women would say. Would they come clean, or would they try to escape unscathed? The outcome felt uncertain, and the man held his breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Then, unexpectedly, the first woman stepped forward, her expression shifting from anger to desperation. "We didn't mean to cause this trouble," she shouted, her voice cracking under pressure. "We were scared. We thought he was following us." But the crowd was having none of it. "That's a lie," shouted someone from the back, and more voices joined in, echoing their disbelief. The man's heart raced as he realized the crowd was no longer just a passive audience. They were becoming part of the story, part of the reckoning that was unfolding before him. With the pressure mounting, the second woman, realizing the tide had turned against them, made a snap decision. "Fine. We'll leave. This is all just a misunderstanding." She grabbed her friend's arm, pulling her away from the officers, but they weren't going anywhere just yet. "Wait a minute," the second officer said, stepping forward. "You can't just walk away from this." The determination in his voice resonated with the crowd, who began to cheer him on. "You need to take responsibility for what you've done." The man's breath hitched in his throat, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Would they really try to escape? Could they slip away without facing the consequences of their actions? The question hung heavily in the air, leaving everyone in suspense, unsure of how this tense situation would resolve. As the confrontation reached a fever pitch, the crowd's energy shifted from a mix of confusion and anticipation to outright determination. The atmosphere felt electric, crackling with emotions and the weight of unspoken truths. The two women stood there, eyes darting between the police officers and the growing throng of supporters behind the man. They were caught, but the desperation in their expressions suggested they weren't ready to admit defeat just yet. Suddenly, without warning, the first woman pulled out her phone and started recording. "I'm documenting this," she declared loudly, her voice shaky but defiant. "You can't just bully us because of your own biases." The crowd gasped, caught off guard by her unexpected move. The shift in her demeanor was alarming. It was as if she was trying to turn the tables, painting herself as the victim in this chaotic scene. The second officer narrowed his eyes, recognizing the tactic. "This isn't about your personal narrative. This is about accountability. You made serious accusations against this man, and we need to sort through the truth." But the woman wasn't backing down. She turned the camera towards the man, framing him in the shot. "Look at him. This is exactly what we were talking about. He's intimidating us right now." The man, taken aback, felt a surge of anger. They were trying to flip the narrative, making it sound as if he were the aggressor, all while they stood there, having initiated the whole debacle. "You're the ones who started this. You came at me," he shouted, trying to regain control of the situation. But the woman continued to speak into the camera, her voice rising. "We're just two women in a park, and we feel threatened by this man. He's making us feel unsafe." The crowd was caught in a tug-of-war of emotions. Some shouted their support for the man, while others hesitated, unsure of which side to believe. It was a whirlwind of conflicting stories, and the tension was palpable. The man felt the ground shift beneath him, realizing the women were not only trying to escape accountability, but were also weaponizing public opinion against him. Just then, a familiar face appeared from the back of the crowd, a friend of the man who had been off to the side, observing the entire scene unfold. He rushed forward, shouting, "What are you doing? You're lying. Everyone saw what happened." The crowd erupted in shouts of agreement, and the women's faces drained of color. It was as if their attempt to control the narrative was quickly unraveling in real time. But the first woman, still focused on her recording, took a step back. "You can't silence us. This is what's wrong with society. You all want to protect this man without knowing the full story." The crowd was divided, and for a moment, it felt like a volatile standoff, as if everyone was teetering on the edge of a chaotic explosion. The officer remained calm, trying to defuse the tension. "We're not here to silence anyone. We're here to find the truth. If you feel threatened, then we need to have a serious conversation about what happened." But even his steady demeanor couldn't quell the escalating drama. In the midst of this chaos, a third party emerged, a local journalist who had been passing through the park when the commotion began. Hearing the raised voices, she pulled out her camera and started filming, instantly turning this moment into a media spectacle. "This could be the story that goes viral," she thought to herself, framing her shot to capture the intensity of the moment. Her presence added another layer to the already complex situation as she began asking the crowd questions and seeking reactions. Is this man really a threat? What do you all think about the women's accusations? The journalist's questions hung in the air, provoking responses that only added to the tension. The crowd became a chorus of voices, each trying to assert their perspective, each person claiming to have the truth. The chaos was unfolding like a dramatic scene from a movie, where the lines between right and wrong became blurred. The two women, realizing they were losing ground, exchanged desperate glances, trying to find a way out of this quagmire. Just when it seemed like their story was collapsing, the first woman pointed back to the man. "Look, we were just trying to enjoy our day. If you people can't see that he's threatening us, then you're part of the problem." In that moment, something shifted. The crowd reacted, and the man felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. The absurdity of her words was almost laughable if it hadn't been so serious. "You're the ones who threatened me. You came at me first," he shouted back, but the first woman continued to speak over him, using her phone as both a shield and a weapon. The tension was rising, and the police officers began to realize they needed to take control of the situation before it spiraled further out of hand. One of the new officers stepped forward. "Listen, everyone. We're not going to resolve this here in a heated argument. We need to separate everyone involved and get clear statements. This is getting out of control." The women, sensing the impending collapse of their story, suddenly turned to the crowd and raised their voices. "This is exactly what we were afraid of. This is what happens to women who speak out. You're all turning against us." Their words were charged with desperation, and for a moment, the crowd hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The man could feel the tide shifting once more, but he didn't want to let their manipulations succeed. "You're the ones who made these accusations. You're the ones who need to be held accountable," he shouted, his voice rising above the noise. Suddenly, a familiar face stepped into the fray, an older woman who had witnessed the entire exchange from the sidelines. She was a resident of the neighborhood and had seen the man before. "I know him. He's a good person," she exclaimed, moving closer to the group. "I've seen him here many times, and he's always been kind and respectful." The women exchanged incredulous looks, as if they were watching their world crumble around them. The crowd began to rally behind the older woman's words, voices rising in support of the man. "We believe him," someone shouted, and others joined in, echoing their agreement. It was a chorus of validation, and the energy shifted palpably. But just when it seemed that the momentum was fully on the man's side, the first woman turned to the journalist, her eyes wild. "You have to help us. This man is a criminal. He's dangerous." It was a last-ditch effort, one that seemed almost desperate. The journalist, taken aback, looked between the man and the women, her mind racing with the possibility of a story. "I'm not taking sides here," she said, her camera still rolling. "But if you're making claims, you need to back them up with evidence." Her words cut through the chaos, revealing the frailty of the women's position. They had no real evidence, just accusations born of fear and prejudice. The police officers exchanged glances, recognizing the pivotal moment. "We're going to need to take statements from everyone," one of them declared firmly. "And we need to speak to you two further about your accusations." The women stiffened, the weight of their lies pressing down heavily upon them. But before anyone could take the next step, the first woman's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an incoming message that sent her expression from fear to fury. "This isn't over," she shouted, glaring at the man. "You have no idea who you're messing with. You think you can just humiliate us like this?" The sudden escalation took everyone by surprise. It was an unexpected twist, one that suggested deeper issues lurking beneath the surface. What did she mean? Who was she referring to? The crowd buzzed with renewed uncertainty. Were they witnessing just a simple misunderstanding, or was there something darker at play? The tension climbed higher, leaving everyone in suspense, teetering on the brink of chaos. The police officers began to assess the scene, trying to maintain control, while the crowd's emotions continued to swirl. Each moment felt charged, filled with potential energy that could explode in any direction. In that heightened atmosphere, the man felt a chill run down his spine. He knew this was far from over. The women were desperate, and desperation often led people to act unpredictably. The stakes had risen, and now the entire situation was spiraling into a territory none of them had anticipated. The crowd remained at a standstill, caught between sympathy for the man and confusion over the women's motives. And in that moment of uncertainty, the man realized he needed to prepare for whatever came next. Would the truth prevail, or would their lies continue to fester, morphing into something even more dangerous? The ground felt unsteady beneath him, and he braced himself for the impending storm that was about to unfold. The climax loomed ahead, but the resolution was still shrouded in uncertainty, leaving everyone eager to see how this tense drama would play out. The tension in the park reached a boiling point. The air felt thick with anticipation. The crowd was on edge, murmurs swirling like a whirlwind of uncertainty. The two women stood at the center, their expressions shifting from desperation to defiance. The man, feeling the weight of every gaze, understood that the climax of this chaotic day was upon them. The first woman's phone buzzed again, but this time, she barely glanced at it. Her focus shifted back to the crowd, her voice rising in volume. "You all think you know the truth, but you don't? You're just as guilty as he is." The accusation hung in the air, shocking the crowd into silence. Gasps echoed, and the man felt his heart race. It was clear she was trying to distract everyone from the unraveling narrative that had begun to turn against her. Before he could react, the second woman piped up, her voice shaky but filled with a new kind of energy. "We just wanted to feel safe. You have no idea what it's like to be scared." The shift in her tone was notable. It felt almost like a plea for understanding. But the crowd wasn't buying it. The earlier support for the man surged back, and voices began to echo through the park once more. "Why did you call the police if he wasn't doing anything?" Someone shouted from the back. "You can't just make up a story and expect everyone to believe it." The words struck like a thunderbolt, and the tension grew taut as a bowstring. Realizing the tide was turning, the first woman looked at the journalist, her desperation mounting. "You have to help us. We can't just let this go." But the journalist, having been swept up in the chaos, maintained her neutrality. "I'm just here to document the events. The truth will come out, one way or another." Suddenly, the older woman who had previously defended the man stepped forward again, a determined look on her face. "If you're scared, then why did you confront him? You were the ones who started this." Her voice rang out with authority, and the crowd rallied behind her, emboldened by her words. Feeling emboldened by the older woman's defense, the man took a deep breath, ready to speak. "You all heard what happened. I was minding my own business, and I didn't do anything wrong." His voice cut through clamor, drawing crowds' attention. "I understand fear, but you can't let it turn you into something you're not. We need to take responsibility for our actions." But before anyone could respond, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. A group of men approached, their presence commanding and intense. The man recognized one of them, a local community leader who had always advocated for justice and unity. "What's going on here?" he demanded, scanning the scene, his voice steady yet firm. The tension shifted again, and the newcomer's authoritative presence began to quell the chaos. "We need to address this situation calmly and with clarity." "What's the issue?" he asked, turning to the police officers and then to the two women. The first woman stepped forward, her bravado slipping as she felt weight of scrutiny upon her. "We were just trying to protect ourselves," she exclaimed, but the leader didn't let her off the hook. "Protecting yourself is one thing, but lying is another. If this man is innocent, you're doing him a disservice by perpetuating this lie." His words were direct, piercing through the tension like a knife. The crowd shifted uneasily, recognizing the gravity of what he was saying. As the older woman and the community leader began to speak more directly to the police, explaining how crucial it was to ensure the truth was revealed, the atmosphere began to shift once more. It was as if everyone was taking a collective breath, preparing for whatever would come next. In that moment, the first woman's resolve faltered completely. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she stammered, looking around at the crowd. "We were scared, and I thought we'd get help. I didn't want it to turn into this." Her confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. As the crowd processed her words, a wave of realization swept through them. They had witnessed a small narrative spiral into something much larger, fueled by fear and misunderstanding. The man felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. It was clear the women had acted out of panic, but the repercussions were real. With the spotlight now fully on her, the first woman broke down, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to feel safe." Her sobs echoed, resonating through the crowd. The second woman, watching her friend unravel, stepped forward, her own facade crumbling. "We were wrong. We let our fear take over. Please, we didn't mean for it to escalate like this." The crowd's mood began to shift again, moving from outrage to empathy. People began to murmur softly among themselves, and some reached out, expressing their understanding. "We all feel scared sometimes," one voice said. "It's okay to be afraid. What's important is how we handle that fear." The police officers exchanged glances, recognizing that the situation was evolving into something far more complex than they had anticipated. One officer nodded to the community leader, and they began to facilitate a more constructive dialogue. "I understand that fear can lead to misunderstandings," the leader said, addressing both women and the man. "But we have to ensure that this doesn't happen again. We need to be honest with ourselves and each other. There's a fine line between protecting ourselves and causing harm to others." As the atmosphere began to calm, the first woman took a deep breath. "I just wanted to feel safe in my own skin, but I realize now that I put that ahead of someone else's dignity." The crowd began to respond with nods of agreement, and the emotional tension slowly transformed into a collective understanding. Then, unexpectedly, the second woman pulled out her phone again, but this time it was to share a message, not to record. "Wait, there's something I need to show everyone." She opened her social media app and scrolled through her notifications. The crowd leaned in, curiosity piquing their interest. "I just got a message from someone who saw us from a distance." They caught everything on video. Gasps echoed through the crowd as the woman started to play the footage on her phone. The video revealed the moments leading up to the confrontation, capturing the genuine confusion and distress that had erupted. But it also showcased the man's calm demeanor and his attempts to defuse the situation before the women made their accusations. As the footage played, people in the crowd began to murmur in realization. "See? He wasn't doing anything wrong," someone exclaimed, and the crowd erupted into a chorus of support for the man once more. The gravity of the women's misstep was laid bare, and the realization hit home for everyone present. The community leader, witnessing the video, nodded solemnly. "This is a perfect example of how misunderstandings can escalate if we aren't careful. It's a reminder for all of us to communicate openly and honestly, especially when fear is involved." Feeling the weight of their actions, the two women stepped back, allowing the crowd to express their support for the man. He felt a surge of relief and gratitude. Finally, the truth was coming to light. It felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted, and the chaos was slowly giving way to clarity. But just when it seemed like the situation had resolved itself, the first woman turned to her friend, her voice trembling with urgency. "Wait, what if someone recorded my call to the police? What if they saw everything?" The fear in her voice was palpable, and it sent a ripple of tension through the crowd once more. The second woman's eyes widened in horror. "Oh no, what if there's evidence of us lying? What if we get in trouble?" The panic in their expressions transformed the atmosphere from relief back to anxiety. The crowd murmured again, sensing that the story was far from over. Before anyone could respond, the first woman's phone buzzed loudly again, and she froze, staring at the screen in horror. "It's from the police," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They want me to come in for questioning." The crowd collectively held their breath, the tension crackling in the air once more. The man felt a knot form in his stomach as he processed the implications of her words. This wasn't just a matter of public opinion anymore. The police would dig deeper, and the truth would unravel in ways no one anticipated. But then, in a surprising twist, the older woman stepped forward, looking straight at the two women. "You have a chance to make this right. You need to be honest. It's time to own up to what you did and stop the cycle of fear and blame. Her voice was calm, yet filled with conviction, resonating through the crowd. The two women stood silent, their expressions shifting as the weight of the moment bore down on them. They exchanged looks of uncertainty, but the resolve in the older woman's gaze ignited something within them. Perhaps this was their moment for redemption. I'm sorry, the first woman said finally, her voice breaking. I never wanted any of this. I just acted out of fear. I see that now. The second woman nodded, tears welling in her eyes. We need to face the consequences of our actions. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem. As they spoke, the atmosphere began to shift once more. The crowd murmured, sensing a newfound honesty, a willingness to face the truth. The man felt a weight lift from his shoulders. This was the resolution he had hoped for, but it wasn't complete yet. In that moment, the community leader stepped forward. This isn't just about punishment, it's about learning and growing. We can turn this into a lesson for everyone. He addressed the crowd, emphasizing the importance of understanding and compassion in a world that often rushed to judgment. As the crowd rallied around the idea of growth and unity, the police officers stepped back, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a collective sense of hope. They were witnessing a community coming together, ready to learn from the past and create a better future. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, the man felt a sense of relief wash over him. The truth had emerged, and while the path to resolution was complex, it was one filled with understanding. He had stood his ground, and now he felt the community rallying behind him, ready to move forward. But just as everyone thought they could finally exhale, the first woman turned to the crowd, her expression filled with sudden realization. Wait, what if the police saw everything that happened today? What if they record all of this? The crowd fell silent again, the reality of the situation sinking in. The unexpected twist sent waves of uncertainty through everyone present. The realization that their actions would have consequences ignited a new conversation about accountability, justice, and the journey ahead. As the crowd began to disperse, the man looked at the women, who were now filled with a mix of fear and determination. Perhaps this unexpected twist would be their turning point, a moment that could shape not only their lives, but also the lives of everyone in the community. The man felt a sense of hope blossoming amid the uncertainty. They were standing at a crossroads, ready to embark on a journey of healing and understanding, but the path ahead remained unwritten. And as he watched the crowd fade into the twilight, he knew that the story was far from over, it was just beginning.